So first, let's look at the theory behind caching. With a normal request, the web browser sends a request to the web server, such as product/42. Web server hands that request off to Rails, which dynamically generates the content, sends that back to the web browser. Normal requests just happen automatically that way through to Rails. Now, the first step of a page cache request is going to be mostly the same. Web browser sends a request to the web server sends that request onto Rails, but the difference here, Rails writes a HTML file to the public directory of the web server. It gives it an HTML extension or what corresponding to whatever kind of file was requested. Normal content is then sent back to the web browser. That request is not going to be any faster, but the next request will, because the web server recognizes that a matching file already exists in the public directory, sends that straight back to the web browser. Rails is not involved at all. Can be much, much faster. In part 2 of this screencast, we'll look at actually benchmarking that. So with that in mind, let's drill in just a little bit deeper to a request. Once it gets into Rails, this will tell us about the action and fragment caching techniques that we can use. Now, the time spent responding to a request within Rails, some of that happens within Rails itself, some happens in the database, MySQL, Postgres, whatever you're using, and some happens rendering templates. Those technically happen inside Rails itself, but these are the kinds of things that we can easily break out and look up some statistics on using the production log analyzer or something similar. Now, page caching skips out on all that. We don't have to touch Rails, doesn't even touch the database, doesn't touch template rendering, because once a file is written to the public directory of the web server, Rails isn't even involved at all. It's just sending straight files back to the browser. But sometimes we don't want something that drastic. We want a little bit more control. We actually want Rails to have a little bit of a part in the process. So fragment caching gives us an opportunity to get rid of some of the database calls potentially, get rid of template rendering potentially, and let just the last little bit of Rails itself be involved in the request. So action and fragment caching both can benefit from this kind of a scheme. We'll look at how you can do that. Now, this looks just a little bit different on the web server side of things. What happens is first a request comes in, product/42, gets handed off to Rails. This time though, instead of writing a file to the public directory, it writes a special file.cache to Rails' own directory. The web server doesn't know anything about these cached files that are part of the fragment cache. Rails is responsible for handling those, sending them back to the browser. So same thing, first request, a file gets cached. The next request, Rails looks for that file and sends it back to the browser. So that's the benefit of fragment caching from a high-level perspective. The tricky thing about fragment caching is there's less of a clear benefit immediately. You're going to have to apply it more judiciously to the parts of your app that are slower.